Hello, my name is Destiny Thompson, and today I will be discussing what I learned about diversity as a part of my capstone negotiating diversity. So, I'm an English major, which means most of my time here at Mount has been dedicated to trying to analyze and decipher an author's message in their work of literature. An author's message can either be explicit, meaning that the message is right in your face, it's easy to pinpoint, it's clear to understand. Or an author's message can be implicit, which means that the author's message is not so obvious. You may have to do a little digging, a little research, or just reread it to really figure out what they're trying to say. The language an author uses can make this journey even more complicated. Depending on the type of language used, you could think an author means one thing, but in reality, they mean something completely different. If this was literature class, I think we'd call this a satire. Or in some cases, something that sounds different holds the exact same meaning. However, it creates a different perspective. Let me give you an example. In an academic journal on how language shapes thoughts and perceptions, Lyra Boroditsky mentions the wording used when former Vice President Dick Cheney accidentally shot Harry Whittington during a hunting outing. As you can see on the screen, the incident can be said in a variety of ways, either giving direct or distant blame to who committed the act. So, as you see in the first sentence, there is a direct cause. Cheney shot Whittington. In the second sentence, you see there's a little bit of a distance in who caused the accidental shooting. Whittington got shot by Cheney. In the third sentence, which is a direct quote from Cheney, it further distances him from the incident. He's ultimately just the guy who pulled the trigger that fired the round that hit Harry. And in the fourth sentence, you don't really see who's to blame for the incident. This is from the perspective of George W. Bush, where he heard a bird flush and he turned and pulled the trigger and saw his friend get wounded. So he doesn't name any names. He doesn't necessarily put a blame on anyone. Each sentence gives a new perspective. Whichever way you spin it, though, the outcome stays the same. Whittington was shot. I'm telling you all this to get to the simple point. Words matter. The words and language we use have meaning, and they create an impact based on what is said and how it is said. So, what does this have to do with diversity? In truth, it has everything to do with it. The words we use when referring to diversity can help support its progress or assist in breaking it down. Words and language can work to confront systemic racism, prejudice, and stereotypes, or further perpetuate it. So, a major takeaway of what I learned about diversity is that racial coding affects our lives more than we realize. Racial coding and racially charged language has been saturated in this country, has saturated this country in particular since the creation of the states. And this quote by W.E.B. Du Bois kind of perfectly explains how racially coded language has saturated this country. He talks about the fate of the Black community in the post-slavery and Reconstruction era, and he says, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. And in many ways, he's very accurate because following the Civil War, the 13th Amendment stated that, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or at any place subject to their jurisdiction. So as you know from the 13th Amendment, this abolishes slavery. However, this creates a loophole as well based on the language. Forced or involuntary servitude was illegal, with the exception that a person was arrested and sentenced for the crime that they committed. And this clever language ended up specifically targeting newly freed slaves, or Black people, who would often be picked up by police and arrested for usually minor or petty crimes such as loitering, thus legally getting slave-like labor from these people. The same type of racially charged language would also eventually lead to the major issue of mass incarceration, as it has been noted in the Netflix documentary 13th. The language of the 13th Amendment was only the beginning of racial coding. The Southern strategy, explained by Lee Atwater in 1981 in his infamous interview, was the method Republican politicians used in order to gain the vote of racists without saying openly racist things. So, as he says in his infamous interview, you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, all that stuff. Now you're getting abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this. It's so much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger nigger. The result is an underlying foundation of racism that has become ingrained in every aspect of society, from education to jobs to housing. The words politicians and lawmakers, as Lee Atwater has explained, are effective in keeping minority groups, particularly Black and brown people, at the bottom. Robin DiAngelo, who is the author of White Fragility, which we read in class, calls racially coded language a perpetuator of racist stereotypes and overall a lack of concern for how racism truly impacts people of color. And she says racially coded language reproduces racist images and perspectives while simultaneously reproducing the comfortable illusion that race and its problems are what they have, not us. So with racially coded language, it creates even more of a divide between white people and people of color. Through racially coded language, we kind of separate the people of color by saying these are the issues that only they deal with. Only they deal with welfare. Only they deal with not being able to pay for a house or get a loan. Only they deal with bad schools and poor neighborhoods, when in reality, it affects all of us. So as a result, the words we hear specifically refer to Black and brown people without having to even mention race. However, most of us know that it is implied. Ian Haney Lopez, a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of Dog Whistle Politics, explains that, quote, current racial code operates by appealing to deep-seated stereotypes of groups that are perceived as threatening, but they differ from the naked racial terms in that they don't emphasize biology. So it's not references to Black skin or brown skin. So the words I listed on this slide are just some of the many ways people of color and their experiences are described. So you have urban and inner city and disadvantaged when referring to predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. You have the term thug, which criminalizes Black and brown people and creates a heightened alarm among non-people of color. You have the war on drugs, which was a way of criminalizing the crack epidemic that began in the 80s, and it's still a criminalization of marijuana today. You have ghetto, which is another term used for people or the place that predominantly Black and brown people live in. You have ratchet. You have illegal alien or illegal immigrant when referring to Hispanics. You have law and order, which goes back to the war on drugs and the criminalization of drugs. You have rioting, when there are people of color who are peacefully protesting in the streets. You have welfare queen, which solidifies and perpetuates the stereotype that Black and brown people are lazy. They just want to live off of welfare for the rest of their lives. And you also have states' rights, which is another way of just separating minorities from the majority. So that could be a segregation of schools. That could be not letting LGBTQ couples marry or have their rights like they need to. So, although these words are implicit in language, they paint an explicit picture of who they are directed to. As I stated earlier, words matter. Racially coded language, although it does not explicitly refer to race, is racist language nonetheless. It is a language embedded in our society that has been created to define and target minority groups. This is a shocking reality that I have learned over the course of this semester. Because of its deep roots within our society, it has been proven to be very difficult to break down racially coded language. However, by educating ourselves about diversity and the true impact of racism inside and outside of the classroom, I believe we have the potential to stop perpetuating racism within ourselves and hopefully spreading that change outward. These are my references, and thank you for listening.